A single act of kindness can rewrite a lifetime in less than 24 hours. The words would mean nothing to Ethan Carter as he rushed through the sliding doors of Riverside Mall on a late Saturday afternoon, his attention divided between a shopping list in his pocket and the small hand of his 6-year-old son Noah. Ethan was a 38-year-old single father with tired eyes, worn work boots, and the kind of steady patience that came from surviving more than most people ever saw on the surface. He worked 2 jobs during the week, repaired appliances on weekends, and still somehow managed to make sure Noah never felt the weight of their financial struggle. That afternoon, the mall was unusually crowded, filled with families, tourists, and shoppers moving between bright storefronts. Ethan stopped briefly near a central seating area when Noah tugged gently on his sleeve. "Dad, I want to see the fountain," Noah said with innocent excitement, pointing toward the decorative indoor fountain just a short distance away. Ethan nodded, adjusting the small backpack on his son's shoulders. "Stay close," he replied with a warm but careful smile. It happened in seconds. A sudden misstep near the edge of the fountain caused a small child to lose balance. Gasps echoed as people noticed too late that the child was about to fall into the shallow but slippery water basin. Without hesitation, Ethan moved. He did not think about consequences, money, or the crowd watching. He simply reacted. In one smooth motion, he reached forward and caught the child before they could fall fully into the fountain. The moment froze in silence. Water splashed slightly across the polished stone edge, but the child was safe. Noah stood nearby with wide eyes, holding on to his father's jacket. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked the frightened child gently, lowering himself to their level. The child nodded slowly, still shaken but unharmed. A woman rushed forward moments later, her designer clothing and anxious expression revealing her status before she even spoke. "That is my daughter," she said quickly, her voice filled with relief and disbelief. Ethan simply nodded and carefully guided the child back into her mother's arms. She slipped. "The floor is wet near the edge," he said calmly. Around them, the crowd slowly realized what had happened. There was no dramatic rescue speech, no demand for attention, no expectation of reward. Just a man who had acted before thinking. Unknown to Ethan, the woman holding her daughter was Victoria Bennett, a billionaire known for leading one of the most influential family investment groups in the country. She stood frozen for a moment, studying the man who had saved her child as if trying to understand something she could not immediately explain. Ethan adjusted Noah's backpack again and prepared to leave, unaware that this single quiet moment inside a crowded mall would become the beginning of a chain reaction that would reshape both of their lives forever. The afternoon at Riverside Mall continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but for Ethan Carter, something inside the atmosphere had already shifted in ways he could not name. He held his son Noah's hand as they walked past storefronts glowing with bright advertisements and polished glass displays, the ordinary rhythm of weekend shopping slowly returning around them. Ethan did not linger on what had just occurred near the fountain. For him, it had simply been a moment where a child needed help, and he had acted without hesitation, as any parent or decent person might do. Noah looked up at him with quiet admiration. "Dad, that lady was really scared," he said softly. Ethan nodded. "She just cares about her daughter. That is all." He gently adjusted Noah's jacket as they moved toward the exit, already thinking about the small repair job waiting for him later that evening and how the extra payment from it would help cover next month's rent. Across the mall, however, the situation was far from ordinary. Victoria Bennett stood near the fountain, still holding her daughter Olivia close, though Olivia had already recovered from the shock and was now looking back toward the direction Ethan had walked. Victoria's security team had quietly surrounded her, but she raised a hand to signal them to stay back. Her focus remained locked on the man who had disappeared into the crowd without asking for recognition, compensation, or even a name exchange. "Find him," she said calmly to one of her assistants. The assistant hesitated. "Ma'am, we have his description, but he left before we could properly identify him." Victoria did not look away from the direction Ethan had gone. "Then find him again. I want to know who he is." Olivia tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. "He was nice," she said with a small, thoughtful voice. Victoria softened slightly as she looked down at her daughter. Yes, she replied. He was. Later that evening, Ethan was back in his small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space was modest, with slightly worn furniture, a stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, and the soft hum of a refrigerator that had seen better days. Noah sat at the small dining table finishing homework while Ethan repaired a broken toaster he had picked up from a neighbor earlier that week. The work was simple but important. Every repaired appliance meant a few extra dollars, every small job another step toward stability. He paused briefly when Noah spoke again. Dad, do you think that lady will be okay? Ethan looked up from the toaster and smiled faintly. She has people who take care of her, he said gently. But I think she was already okay the moment she realized her daughter was safe. That same night, inside a large glass-walled residence overlooking the city skyline, Victoria Bennett stood alone in her private study reviewing security footage from the mall. The recording showed everything clearly: Olivia slipping, the crowd reacting too slowly, and Ethan Carter moving without hesitation, reaching the child just before she fell. There was no hesitation in his body language, no concern for status or attention, only instinctive action driven by responsibility. Victoria paused the footage on his face. Something about his expression unsettled her in a quiet but profound way. He did not look like someone trying to be a hero. He looked like someone who had done difficult things before and simply chosen to do one more without question. Her assistant entered quietly. We located his identity, she said. Ethan Carter. Single father. Works multiple jobs. No criminal record. Financially, struggling. Victoria listened without reacting, her eyes still fixed on the paused image. After a long silence she spoke. Prepare a private meeting. No press. No announcements. The assistant nodded. When? Victoria's gaze did not move from the screen. Tomorrow. Outside, the city continued its endless movement of lights and noise, unaware that a quiet decision made in a private room would soon begin to change the life of a man who had not asked for anything in return for saving a child he did not even know. The next morning arrived with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the unseen shift already unfolding behind the city's polished glass towers. Ethan Carter woke before sunrise as he always did, gently removing his arm from the small blanket that had slipped off Noah during the night. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of early traffic outside and the soft ticking of a wall clock that had been running slightly fast for months. Ethan stood for a moment by the kitchen window, looking out at the gray-blue horizon, already mentally calculating the day ahead: a small repair job in the morning, another delivery in the afternoon, and hopefully enough time to pick up groceries before prices increased again at the local store. Noah stirred awake shortly after, rubbing his eyes and greeting his father with a sleepy smile. Good morning, Dad. Ethan smiled back immediately, the fatigue of the previous day disappearing for a moment. Good morning, buddy. Big school day today. He prepared breakfast with practiced efficiency, ensuring Noah had everything he needed before walking him to the bus stop outside their modest building. Nothing about their routine suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Bennett stood in the center of her private office overlooking the skyline, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that lacked the usual corporate sharpness she was known for. She had canceled 3 meetings without explanation. Her assistant, Megan Foster, carefully reviewed the updated schedule. The meeting with the board has been postponed, Megan said. Victoria nodded once. Good. Megan hesitated before continuing. The man from the mall has been confirmed. Ethan Carter. He lives in the Eastern District. Financial records show he is supporting a child alone. Victoria did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward the window and looked down at the city streets far below. Has he agreed to meet? She finally asked. Not yet, Megan replied. He has not been informed of the reason. Victoria turned slightly. Then we will inform him in person. At the same time, Ethan was working under the hood of a broken delivery van outside a small convenience store when a black luxury vehicle slowly pulled up to the curb. He noticed it immediately, not because he expected anything unusual, but because vehicles like that rarely appeared in his part of town. The driver stepped out first, followed by another man who stood respectfully aside. Finally, Victoria Bennett exited the car. She did not wear the imposing presence of a corporate executive that day. Instead, she appeared simply composed, almost restrained, as if intentionally lowering the distance between their worlds. Ethan straightened slowly, wiping his hands with a rag. Noah, who had been sitting nearby drawing on a notebook, looked up curiously. Victoria approached with calm precision. "Mr. Carter," she said politely. Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, still uncertain of the situation. "That is me." A brief silence followed before Victoria continued. "My name is Victoria Bennett. You helped my daughter yesterday." Ethan immediately recognized the name, though he showed no visible reaction beyond polite attention. "I am glad she is okay," he said simply. Victoria studied him carefully, noticing how quickly he had dismissed his own role in the event. "I would like to thank you properly," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "There is no need. Anyone would have done the same." Behind her, Megan exchanged a subtle glance with the driver, both aware that this was not the typical response they encountered in situations involving their employer. Victoria, however, did not seem surprised. Instead, she looked toward Noah, who had quietly stepped closer to his father. "Is he your son?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. "Yes." Noah offered a shy wave. Victoria returned the gesture warmly. "He is very polite." Ethan placed a protective hand lightly on his son's shoulder without even realizing it. Victoria paused, then spoke again. "I would like to invite you both to dinner. Not as a transaction. As a gesture of gratitude." Ethan hesitated for the first time. He was not used to invitations from people like her, and even less comfortable accepting anything that felt beyond simple exchange. "I am not sure that is necessary," he said carefully. Victoria met his eyes directly. "It is not necessary," she replied. "But it is important." A quiet tension lingered between them, not of conflict, but of two entirely different worlds trying to understand each other in real time. Noah looked up at his father, sensing the weight of the moment without fully understanding it. Ethan exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "All right," he said. "One dinner." Victoria's expression softened slightly, as if she had just crossed an invisible boundary that had been difficult to approach. "Tomorrow evening," she said. As the car slowly drove away, Ethan returned to the broken engine in front of him, but his thoughts no longer stayed fully on the repair. For the first time, he wondered not what the encounter might cost him, but what kind of story had just begun without his permission. The evening arrived slowly, wrapping the city in a soft amber glow as Ethan Carter finished the last repair of the day. The small convenience store parking lot had grown quiet, with only occasional passing cars breaking the stillness of the suburban street. Ethan wiped his hands clean and leaned against the side of the delivery van he had just fixed, taking a brief moment to check the time. Noah would be finishing school soon, and he still needed to stop by the grocery store before heading home. Life had a rhythm that was predictable, even if it was not easy. That rhythm shifted again when a familiar black vehicle came into view. Ethan noticed it immediately, though he did not react with surprise. Victoria Bennett stepped out once more, this time without her assistant. She looked composed, but there was a different kind of focus in her expression, as if she had made a decision that required personal presence rather than delegation. Ethan straightened and greeted her with calm politeness. "Good evening," he said. Victoria nodded slightly. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. I hope I am not interrupting your work." Ethan glanced toward the repaired van. "I just finished." A brief silence followed before Victoria spoke again. "I kept my promise. Dinner is still on the table, but I wanted to speak with you first." Ethan listened without interruption, his attention steady but cautious. Victoria continued, yesterday was not just about gratitude. It was about understanding something I had overlooked for a long time. Ethan remained quiet, waiting. Victoria took a slow breath. People in my position are often surrounded by protection, distance, and assumptions. It becomes easy to forget how quickly a single moment of human instinct can matter more than all of that combined. Ethan looked briefly toward the ground before responding. I did not think about any of that in the moment. Victoria nodded. That is exactly why it mattered. A pause settled between them. The sound of distant traffic filled the silence, grounding the conversation in the reality of the ordinary world around them. Noah arrived shortly after, stepping out of a school bus that had just pulled up near the corner. He immediately spotted his father and smiled as he ran over. Victoria observed quietly as Ethan knelt slightly to meet his son's level, adjusting Noah's backpack strap with a familiar gentleness. Did you have a good day? Ethan asked. Noah nodded enthusiastically. We learned about rescue animals today. Victoria smiled faintly at the interaction, something softening in her expression that was not often seen in boardrooms or press conferences. Noah noticed her standing nearby. Are you coming to dinner too? He asked innocently. Victoria hesitated for a brief moment before replying. Yes, if your father still agrees. Ethan looked at his son, then back at Victoria. After a short pause, he nodded. We said one dinner, he reminded gently. Victoria acknowledged the agreement with a small, respectful nod. Then I will make sure it is only one, if that is what you prefer. Later that evening, Ethan and Noah followed Victoria's car to a private residence on the edge of the city. The house was large but not overwhelming, designed with quiet elegance rather than excess. Inside, everything was arranged with precision, yet there was an absence of warmth that Ethan immediately noticed. Noah walked beside his father, looking around curiously but not intimidated. Dinner was served in a dining room filled with soft lighting and minimal conversation at first. Victoria observed Ethan and Noah carefully, noting how naturally they interacted with each other, how easily they communicated without needing anything elaborate. At one point, Noah accidentally dropped his fork, and Ethan immediately replaced it without disrupting the conversation. Victoria spoke quietly after a moment. You make it look effortless. Ethan looked up slightly. What do I make look effortless? Victoria gestured subtly toward Noah. Raising a child alone while still managing everything else. Ethan shook his head slightly. It is never effortless. It is just necessary. The words lingered in the room longer than expected. After dinner, Noah wandered briefly into an adjoining sitting area filled with books and quiet decor. Victoria and Ethan remained at the table. She finally spoke more directly. I want to offer you something, she said. Ethan immediately remained cautious. I already told you I am not interested in charity. Victoria nodded. This is not charity. She paused. It is opportunity. Ethan waited. Victoria continued, my foundation supports families in situations like yours. But more importantly, I am building something that requires people who understand responsibility without needing recognition. Ethan studied her carefully. And you think I am one of those people? Victoria met his gaze. I know you are. A long silence followed. Ethan leaned back slightly, conflicted not by pride alone, but by uncertainty about stepping into a world that felt far removed from his own. From the hallway, Noah's laughter echoed softly as he explored a shelf of books, completely unaware that the conversation in the dining room was quietly shaping the next chapter of his life. Ethan finally spoke. I need time to think. Victoria nodded immediately. Take as much as you need. As the evening came to an end, Ethan and Noah prepared to leave. Standing by the entrance, Victoria looked at them both with a calm but sincere expression. Thank you for coming, she said. Ethan replied simply, thank you for the meal. As they drove away, Ethan glanced at Noah sleeping lightly in the back seat. For the first time, he was not thinking about repair jobs or bills waiting at home. He was thinking about a choice he had not yet made, one that might quietly change everything he had built his life around. The following days passed in a quiet but noticeable shift in Ethan Carter's routine. Nothing about his external life changed immediately, yet internally, every moment felt slightly heavier, as if a door had been opened and left ajar. He continued working his small repair jobs across the neighborhood, arriving early, leaving late, and returning home each evening to his son Noah with the same steady presence that defined his life. However, Victoria Bennett's offer did not leave his thoughts. It lingered in the background of everything he did, like a question he had not yet answered but could no longer ignore. Noah noticed his father's silence more often during breakfast. "Dad, are you thinking about something?" he asked one morning while stirring his cereal. Ethan smiled faintly, trying to reassure him. "Just work things." But it was not entirely true. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Bennett had resumed her public responsibilities, yet her attention frequently drifted back to Ethan Carter's file. It was not just his financial situation that had drawn her interest, but the consistency of his character under pressure. Her assistant, Megan Foster, had completed a deeper review of his background. "He has no history of instability," Megan explained during a meeting. "Multiple verified neighbors describe him as reliable, calm, and unusually patient under stress. He has turned down higher-paying opportunities to maintain stability for his son." Victoria listened without interruption. "And emotionally?" she asked. Megan hesitated slightly. "He is guarded, but not closed off. There is a strong pattern of self-sacrifice." Victoria leaned back in her chair, absorbing the information without reaction. "That is exactly what I suspected," she said quietly. Later that afternoon, Victoria made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She did not schedule another formal meeting. Instead, she returned to the garage where she had first spoken with Ethan. When she arrived, Ethan was in the middle of repairing a worn-out family vehicle. Noah was nearby, reading quietly on a bench. Victoria approached without ceremony. "Mr. Carter," she said. Ethan looked up, slightly surprised but not unsettled. "Ms. Bennett." She nodded. "I have thought about your hesitation." Ethan set down his tools, giving her his full attention. Victoria continued, "I understand why you are cautious. But I also believe that your situation is more fragile than you allow yourself to admit." Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply listened. Victoria softened her tone. "I am not here to take control of your life. I am here to give you a structure that makes it easier for you to continue doing what you already do." Ethan glanced briefly toward Noah, then back at her. "And what exactly does that mean?" Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. "It means stability. Not just for you, but for your son. Education, healthcare, financial relief. But also purpose beyond survival." Ethan exhaled slowly, clearly conflicted. "I have spent my entire life building everything myself," he said. Victoria nodded. "I know." A quiet silence followed, filled only by the sound of distant tools and passing traffic outside the garage. Noah walked closer, sensing the seriousness of the conversation but not fully understanding it. Victoria looked at him gently. "Hello again," she said. Noah smiled slightly. "Hi." Ethan placed a protective but calm hand on his son's shoulder, then spoke again. "If I accept something like this, it stops being just my life." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "It already has." Those words settled between them with unexpected weight. Ethan did not respond immediately. For the first time since they had met, he was not thinking about whether he deserved help or whether it felt right to accept it. He was thinking about what kind of future would remain for Noah if he refused. That evening, after Victoria left, Ethan sat quietly in the garage long after work was finished. Noah had fallen asleep in the small office chair, his head resting gently on folded arms. Ethan looked at his son and then at the tools around him, the life he had built piece by piece through persistence and exhaustion. Finally, he stood up, turned off the lights, and locked the garage door. The decision had not been made yet, but for the first time, he understood that staying exactly where he was would still be a decision in itself. The following morning arrived with a different weight in Ethan Carter's life, though nothing outwardly appeared changed at first glance. The garage was still the same modest structure on the edge of the neighborhood, the tools still carefully arranged along the walls, and the early sunlight still filtered through the open door in familiar golden lines. Yet Ethan moved through the space with a quieter focus than usual, as if something unresolved had begun to shape his thoughts in a more permanent way. Noah was already awake, sitting on an overturned crate inside the small office area, drawing while occasionally humming to himself. Ethan glanced at him several times between tasks, noticing how naturally his son adapted to uncertainty, unaware of the decisions forming around him. Later that morning, Victoria Bennett arrived without prior notice. This time, there was no formal escort of multiple vehicles, only a single black car that stopped calmly outside the garage. Victoria stepped out dressed in a simple, elegant outfit that lacked the usual corporate severity, her presence still refined but noticeably less distant than before. Ethan noticed her immediately and paused what he was doing, wiping his hands slowly as he approached. Noah looked up from his drawing but stayed where he was, observing quietly. "Good morning," Victoria said. Ethan nodded in return. "Good morning." There was a brief silence before she continued. "I wanted to speak with you without schedules or formal arrangements." Ethan studied her carefully. "That sounds like it is already a different conversation." Victoria acknowledged the observation with a slight nod. "It is." She looked briefly toward Noah, who was watching them with quiet curiosity. "May I?" she asked. Ethan glanced at his son, then nodded again. Victoria walked a few steps closer, lowering her tone slightly. "I have reviewed everything carefully," she said. "Not just your financial situation, but your history, your choices, and the way you have handled responsibility under pressure." Ethan did not interrupt. Victoria continued, "What stands out is not that you struggle. Many people struggle. What stands out is how consistently you prioritize someone else's stability over your own comfort." Ethan exhaled slowly, as if the words were not new, but hearing them spoken aloud carried a different weight. "That is not something I planned," he said. "It is just how things had to be." Victoria nodded. "That is exactly why I am here." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I am not offering you charity. I am offering you structure, opportunity, and the ability to continue making the same choices you already make, but without the constant threat of losing everything beneath you." Ethan looked down briefly, then back at her. "And what would you expect in return?" he asked. Victoria responded without hesitation. "Accountability. Perspective. And presence in something that needs people who understand responsibility without ego." A light wind moved through the open garage, carrying the sound of distant traffic. Noah quietly stood and walked closer to his father, sensing that the conversation had reached a point of importance even if he did not fully understand its meaning. Ethan instinctively placed a hand on his son's shoulder again, grounding himself in the familiar weight of that connection. Victoria noticed the gesture but said nothing immediately. Instead, she softened her voice slightly. "You are not being asked to leave your life behind," she said. "You are being asked to stop surviving it alone." The silence that followed was heavier than before, not uncomfortable, but filled with consequence. Ethan looked around the garage, the worn tools, the half-repaired vehicles, the life built through endurance rather than ease. Then he looked at Noah. For a long moment, he did not speak. Victoria waited without pressing, understanding that this was not a decision that could be rushed or persuaded. Finally, Ethan spoke quietly. "If I step into something like this, it changes everything." Victoria met his gaze directly. "It already has," she repeated, echoing his earlier realization but with deeper meaning this time. Ethan nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. "Then I need to make sure it changes in the right direction." Victoria responded simply, "That is all I am asking." Noah tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Dad, are we okay?" Ethan looked down at him and smiled faintly, though the weight in his expression had not fully lifted. "We are always okay," he said softly. Victoria watched this exchange in silence, realizing that whatever decision was coming next would not only define Ethan Carter's future, but also reshape the emotional boundaries of both their worlds in ways neither of them could yet fully understand. The days following Victoria Bennett's proposal did not bring immediate answers, but instead created a quiet tension that settled into Ethan Carter's daily life like an unresolved chord. He continued his work at the garage, repairing vehicles for neighbors and completing small jobs that barely covered essential expenses, yet his focus was no longer entirely present in the physical tasks in front of him. Each movement of his hands was accompanied by thought, each pause between repairs filled with considerations he had never previously allowed himself to entertain. Noah remained his constant grounding presence, returning from school with drawings, stories, and innocent questions that reminded Ethan of what truly mattered beneath financial uncertainty. One evening, while they ate a simple meal at their small kitchen table, Noah looked up and asked, "Dad, are we going to be okay if things change?" Ethan paused for a moment, then responded carefully, "We are okay because we are together. That does not change." Yet even as he said it, he understood that okay no longer meant the same thing it once did. Across the city, Victoria Bennett reviewed internal documents late into the night inside her private office. The decision she had offered Ethan was no longer theoretical, it was now a matter of timing and structure. Her assistant, Megan Foster, stood nearby as she finalized revisions to a foundation initiative focused on transitional support programs for families facing financial instability. "He has not responded formally yet," Megan noted. Victoria nodded slightly. "He is not the kind of person who responds quickly to things that affect his child," she replied. Megan observed her carefully. "You seem certain about him," she said. Victoria did not immediately answer. Instead, she looked toward the city skyline through the glass wall of her office, reflecting on the moment at the mall, the calm certainty in Ethan's actions, and the absence of any expectation in his behavior afterward. "It is not certainty," she finally said. "It is recognition." The following morning, Ethan received a simple message requesting his presence at a private location, not the corporate headquarters, but a modest community development office on the edge of the city. The setting was intentionally neutral, designed to remove pressure rather than amplify it. Ethan arrived alone after ensuring Noah was safely at school, his expression calm but internally measured. Victoria was already there when he arrived. No entourage, no formal presentation, only a table, 2 chairs, and a folder placed neatly in front of one seat. She gestured for him to sit. "Thank you for coming," she said. Ethan nodded once as he sat down. "I wanted to understand exactly what this is before making any assumptions," he said. Victoria acknowledged the statement. "That is reasonable." She slid the folder gently across the table. Ethan did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked at her. "I am not comfortable with being placed into something I do not fully understand," he said. Victoria responded without hesitation. "Then I will explain it clearly." She continued, "This is not employment in the traditional sense. It is integration into a foundation structure designed to support families who are in transition. Your role would not be defined by authority or hierarchy, but by lived understanding of responsibility under pressure." Ethan finally opened the folder. Inside were structured outlines, financial stability plans, housing support options, and a proposed advisory position that did not remove him from his current life but expanded its stability. He read quietly, page by page, his expression steady but increasingly thoughtful. After several minutes, he closed the folder again. "Why me?" he asked simply. Victoria met his gaze. "Because most people who are offered this kind of opportunity either seek it or depend on it," she said. "You did neither. You acted without expectation, and then returned to your life without asking for anything in return." Ethan leaned back slightly, processing her words. "That does not automatically make me qualified," he replied. Victoria nodded. "No. But it makes you necessary." A long silence followed, not tense, but reflective. Ethan glanced briefly down at the folder again, then toward the window where daylight filtered through softly. He thought about Noah, about the future he had been trying to build alone, and about the possibility that survival did not have to mean isolation. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at Victoria. "I will not make a decision today," he said. Victoria responded calmly, "I would not expect you to." As Ethan left the building later that afternoon, he stood outside for a moment before walking toward his car. Nothing had changed yet in his external world, but internally, the structure of his decisions had already begun to shift. For the first time in a long time, the question was no longer how to endure the next day, but what kind of life was worth choosing beyond it. The next stage of Ethan Carter's life unfolded not through sudden transformation, but through a series of quiet, almost unnoticeable moments where possibility began to replace uncertainty. After leaving the community development office, he returned to his daily routine at the garage, yet everything felt slightly altered in tone, as if the world had not changed shape, but had shifted in meaning. He worked through the afternoon repairing a family sedan while Noah sat nearby completing homework, occasionally asking questions about math problems or showing small drawings he had made during school. Ethan responded as he always did, patiently and attentively, but his mind would occasionally drift to the folder he had closed earlier that day. That evening, after Noah had fallen asleep, Ethan sat alone at the small kitchen table, the silence of the apartment surrounding him more noticeably than before. He did not reopen the folder immediately. Instead, he stared at it for a long time, as if waiting for clarity to form on its own. The idea of stepping into something larger than his current life did not feel like ambition. It felt like responsibility that had been redirected toward him without warning. Across the city, Victoria Bennett remained at her office long after most of her staff had left. She reviewed updates from her foundation team, ensuring that every structural element of the proposed program was designed to support stability rather than dependence. Her assistant Megan Foster entered quietly with a final report. "We have prepared everything based on your revisions," Megan said. Victoria nodded without looking away from the documents on her desk. "And his response?" she asked. "Still pending," Megan replied. Victoria paused for a moment. "He will not respond quickly," she said calmly. Megan observed her carefully. "You seem more patient than usual with this," she noted. Victoria finally looked up. "Because this is not a transaction," she said. "It is a decision that will affect how someone defines his own life." The following morning, Ethan received another message requesting his presence, this time not in a formal office setting, but at a quiet public park located near the edge of the city. He arrived with Noah, who was excited simply to spend time outdoors without any expectation of significance. Victoria was already there, seated on a bench near a small walking path lined with trees beginning to shift into early seasonal color. She stood when they approached. "Thank you for coming," she said gently. Ethan nodded. "I wanted to bring Noah," he replied. Victoria looked down at the boy and smiled slightly. "That is fine." Noah immediately ran a few steps ahead toward the open space, leaving the adult standing at a respectful distance. Victoria turned back to Ethan. "Have you thought about what I shared?" she asked. Ethan took a slow breath. "I have thought about it more than I expected," he admitted. Victoria waited without interruption. Ethan continued, "It is not the opportunity itself that is difficult to understand. It is what accepting it means for everything I have built so far." Victoria nodded. "That is the part most people misunderstand," she said. "They think opportunity replaces life. In reality, it expands the weight of it." Ethan glanced toward Noah, who was now watching birds near the edge of a small pond. "I am not afraid of hard work," Ethan said quietly. "I am afraid of changing something that already works in ways I understand." Victoria responded with measured calm. "Then do not think of it as replacing your life," she said. "Think of it as making sure it does not collapse under its own weight." A gentle wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of distant city movement into the quiet space between them. Ethan remained silent for a moment, absorbing the idea not as persuasion, but as reflection. For the first time, the decision was no longer about survival versus risk, but about whether stability could exist without isolation. Noah called out from a short distance, laughing as he pointed at something small moving near the water. Ethan instinctively smiled, watching his son's ease with the world in contrast to his own measured hesitation. Victoria noticed the shift in his expression but said nothing, allowing the moment to settle naturally. Ethan finally spoke. "I cannot decide today," he said again, repeating what had become his most honest answer. Victoria nodded once. "I would not expect you to," she replied. As they eventually parted ways that afternoon, there was no formal agreement, no signature, and no immediate resolution. Yet something subtle had changed. The conversation had moved from whether Ethan would accept the offer to what his life would look like if he did not. And that question, once introduced, no longer disappeared easily into silence. The final decision did not arrive in a dramatic moment, but rather in the quiet accumulation of thoughts that Ethan Carter carried with him through several ordinary days. Life continued in its familiar rhythm at first. He worked at the garage each morning, repaired vehicles for neighbors, and returned home each evening to help Noah with homework and prepare simple meals. Yet something subtle had changed in how he viewed every task. It was no longer just about endurance. It was about direction. Victoria Bennett did not rush him. There were no repeated calls or pressured messages. Instead, there was space, and within that space, Ethan found himself revisiting the same question repeatedly: what would it mean to accept stability without losing identity? One evening, after Noah had fallen asleep, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table with the folder still resting in the same place it had been since the day Victoria first handed it to him. This time, he did not hesitate before opening it. He read everything again slowly, not just the financial support structures or the proposed advisory role, but the intention behind it. It was not framed as ownership of his life, but as reinforcement of it. Outside, the city lights blurred softly through the window, but inside the apartment, everything felt still. Noah's small backpack hung by the door, a reminder of responsibility that never paused. Ethan closed the folder after a long time and leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if releasing something he had carried for too long without realizing it. The next morning, he called the number provided. There was no hesitation in his voice when the call connected, only calm clarity. "I have made my decision," he said. On the other end, Victoria Bennett listened without interruption. "I am ready to understand what this means," Ethan continued. Victoria responded simply, "Then we proceed carefully, step by step." A meeting was arranged once more, this time at the same community office where they had first discussed the opportunity. When Ethan arrived, Noah was with him again, sitting quietly nearby with a book while the adults spoke. Victoria greeted them both with the same composed respect she had shown from the beginning. There was no celebration, no display of victory, only acknowledgement. "You did not rush this decision," she said. Ethan nodded. "I could not afford to make it lightly." Victoria studied him for a moment. "That is exactly why it will work," she said. She then outlined the next phase clearly. Ethan would not be removed from his current life. The garage would remain his foundation, but his experience would now extend into a structured role supporting the foundation's outreach program for families in transition. He would not be defined by title or hierarchy, but by contribution shaped through lived understanding. As she spoke, Ethan listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Noah, who was now quietly drawing at the edge of the room. There was no sense of escape in the proposal, only expansion. When the discussion concluded, Victoria stood. "This is not the end of your life as it is," she said. "It is the beginning of it continuing without constant fear of collapse." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words without resistance. Outside, the afternoon light softened across the parking lot as they stepped out of the building. Noah ran ahead slightly, as children often do when they feel safe without needing explanation. Ethan followed at a steady pace. Victoria walked beside them briefly before stopping near her car. "You made the right decision," she said. Ethan looked at her, not with certainty, but with acceptance. I made a decision I can live with, he replied. Victoria acknowledged this with a slight nod before leaving. As the car drove away, Ethan stood for a moment with Noah beside him, watching the city continue its motion around them. Nothing about the world had changed in appearance, but within his own life, something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer a question of whether he could survive tomorrow. It was now about how he would build all the tomorrows that followed.